Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. Welcome back to this special two-part interview with Professor Nancy Pearcey to celebrate hitting 100 episodes here on Filter. If you missed part one, I'd recommend going back to catch up. However, you'll still get a lot out of part two, even if you don't go back and catch up. In the second segment, we continue our discussion on her latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, exploring the roots of our cultural battle over masculinity, evaluating the voices and influences surrounding masculinity today, and discussing how churches can better engage men. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek and highlighted as one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today. Real quickly, before we get into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to Filter wherever you get your podcast. Also, if you would leave us a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcast, it would greatly help us out. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into part 2 of this great conversation with Nancy Pearcey. So tell us about the history of what masculinity meant and how it changed from earlier history through the Reformation colonial era, and then you spent a lot of time talking about how the Industrial Revolution changed family life, and then through this massive change came a difference in understanding the role of men and masculinity.
Yeah, that's would be another one of my critiques of the book, is that, man, you got to go a lot further back than the Cold War. So I go back to the Industrial Revolution. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, families worked together, on family farms and family industries. So a man was working alongside his wife and his children all day. And so obviously he had to have a much more caretaking attitude. That was the cultural expectations of manliness was much more geared towards, working together with the people you love and have a moral bond with, right? So, men were not only expected to be fathers of their families, but fathers of the community was a common phrase. Duty to God and man. Duty to God and man was another common phrase. So the expectation, the cultural expectation of the time was much more oriented towards, to use a modern phrase, being a family man. You were a family man. That was your essential identity. So taking care of your family and having good relationships, being gentle and patient with your children because you're teaching them to work alongside you and teaching them adult skills. And so that changed dramatically after the Industrial Revolution. Work was taken out of the home. So you no longer had husbands working side by side with their wives and children, people they loved. Mm-hmm. Instead, they were working in competition, as an individual, in competition with other men. And that's when you see the language start to change. People didn't like the change they were seeing because they were seeing that men were kind of losing that caretaking mentality. They were it seemed that in the commercial workplace, you needed to be aggressive and assertive and look out for number one, and acquisitive, and all that matters is the bottom line. And this is the language of the day. You start to see people criticizing men. I mean, the idea that masculinity is toxic really starts here because they start saying, look at our men. They're becoming worse. Our men are acquiring characteristics that we don't like. And secularization was happening at that time, too, because along with the Industrial Revolution, they developed a very large public square, right? So a public sphere of factories and industry and banks and academia and government. And this large public sphere, people began to say, well, that should be secular. That should be value-free. I mean, that's what we hear today, right? Don't bring your personal values into the public square. Keep them in the private realm. That's when that happened. And so men who were getting their education and working in the public square were becoming secular before women were. And so they were also becoming less committed to the biblical ethic. And so that also started to affect concepts of masculinity, because people began to say, well, that, that men were just naturally more prone to sin and vice. And of course, many of the more traditional male vices were also increasing at the time. Since men were becoming more secular, there was a lot more drinking, gambling, fighting, gangs, prostitution. And that explains why there was a huge growth of reform movements in the 19th century to address all of these problems, especially young men, because they were coming in from the countryside and leaving behind accountability structures like their family, their church, their village. And they were coming to the cities, and they were much more prone to these, the vices that were available in the city. And so that's why you had reform movements, the temperance movement. I'll give you one fact to sort of hang this on. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So drinking actually was a real problem. Public drunkenness had become a problem. So there was a reason that there was a temperance movement. Yeah. And there were movements against prostitution. There were movements against gambling and cockfighting, and and of course, and the abolition movement against slavery. And the problem is, of course, that most of these were male vices. Here's how one historian puts it. She says, there was little doubt as to the sex of the slave masters, the tavern keepers, the clients at the brothel, the seducers, the drunkards. In other words, the language grew even more negative about masculinity during the reform movements. So even though these reform movements did a lot of good, they also had some negative baggage, which is they actually increased the negative descriptions of the male character. So you really can't deal with toxic masculinity unless you go all the way back there. And then and I have a whole chapter on Darwinism as well, because that sort of clinched it.
Yeah.
Darwin taught people that, up until then, ever since the ancient Greeks, people had thought the goal in life was to master your lower impulses, by the higher capacities of moral will and rationality.
Yeah.
Darwin said no. He turned it upside down. He said, no, your true self is the beast within, your animal nature. The animal nature has developed through the struggle for survival. And so the ones who won out were the ones who were tough and dominant and even predatory.
Yeah.
And so Darwin helped to valorize a definition of masculinity that focused on the biological impulses of lust and control and dominance. So these toxic concepts of masculinity have a long history, and we need to know that. We cannot really deal with something adequately unless we know where it came from and how it developed. So that's why I think we need to know some of this history of where these negative concepts of masculinity came from.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to find anyone who's speaking on masculinity and men's issues today. It's hard to find anyone who tries to define masculinity without using biological evolution to describe it. They resort to, men were hunter-gatherers, and so that's why today men are more aggressive, or and this and that. They always result to an evolutionary story. And so that makes a lot of sense today that Darwinism has had such a large impact on defining masculinity. And that does seem to be a really difficult task. One of the things that I appreciate about your book, a big light bulb moment for me, was how you showed how the definition and understanding of masculinity was demoralized through the Industrial Revolution. And what you meant by that, not demoralized in the sense of discouraged, but in the sense of the morality taken out of it. How previously masculinity was understood primarily in moral terms, but then once men went off to give their lives over to business and career, it was changed into sort of temperament terms. aggressiveness, assertiveness, competitiveness, and so on. Can you describe that demoralization of the understanding of masculinity, and then how that affected the ongoing relationship in the history after that between men and women?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked. That's a good question. So it was in the today we're used to the double standard, right? We're kind of used to the idea that, like in a dating relationship, it's a woman who's supposed to hold the line. I ask my students if that's still the case, but yeah, definitely. And I saw a questionnaire recently that's two of the questions were: women are more pure than men, and women are more morally sensitive, I think is the way they put it, than men. And I thought, you even got those questions in a questionnaire? And this just popped up recently, through Twitter or some social media, some questionnaire. Anyway, where did we get the double standard? I was shocked to discover how recent that is. That's the 19th century. Before that, men were thought to be morally superior. Mm-hmm. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, the insight between right and wrong was thought to be a rational insight. And since men are more rational, were thought to be more rational, therefore men were more moral. And so from the time of the ancients, people thought men were the ones who were more masculine, more moral, more spiritual. In fact, the word virtue, do you know the Latin root of virtue? The word virtue? V-I-R? Mm-hmm. It's Latin for man. Mm-hmm. Virtue comes from the word man. And so it originally had connotations of manly strength and honor. It's like the word virile, V-I-R, virile. So, yeah, virtue was not a feminine quality. It was thought to be a masculine quality. And this all changed after the Industrial Revolution, because as men went out to the workplace, to offices and factories, which were becoming secularized, many people thought that their men were becoming, like you said, more sort of aggressive, competitive, and taking on traits that were not suitable for coming. When they came home at night, these were not the traits that you want as a husband and father. And so for the first time ever in human history, women began to be said to be the more moral, more spiritually sensitive than men. This was completely new. This had never happened before in all of human history. That because the public realm was supposed to be value-free, values had to be cultivated in the private realm, at home, in church. And who's at home? Women. So women were, in a sense, tasked with being the moral guardians of society. And when the men came home at night, they were supposed to reform and remoralize their men. Yeah. Men were supposed to come home and be reformed by their morally superior wives. And so that became the it's sometimes called the doctrine of separate spheres. Men work in one sphere, the public sphere, and then they come home at night, and the women have to teach them again how to be moral and gentle and so on with their family. But notice what's happening. And I should add, we talked about the reform movements. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what this is. I think maybe an allergy happened because I was up all night coughing.
That's fine.
So we might want to cut this part. I've not been having this. It just started last night. We talked about the reform movements of the 19th century. Well, most of them were led by women. And so there was a kind of a male-female dimension there too, that women were leading the reform against what I said were traditionally male vices. So again, women were seen as the moral reformers of society. Well, but what did that mean for men? That meant men were being let off the hook. If you're tasking women with being the moral guardians of society, then what are you saying about men? You're essentially saying they are no longer to be trusted to be moral leaders in the home and in society. There's one historian. There are not very many books on the history of masculinity, by the way. This is another reason that my book has a lot of material that nobody knows. they don't know about that sociological literature I talked about earlier, but they don't know this history either, because of feminism, we have whole libraries of books about women and women's history. I found like a smattering of books about men and the history of masculinity. And so one of my books it repeatedly used the phrase, it was letting men off the hook.
Yeah.
The more you treated women as morally superior, the more you let men off the hook. And so the reform movements, for example, like the temperance movement was largely women. Well, it's churches and women. It was led by churches and women. But the illustrations of the day, I found several of them. It's fun. By the way, the book has several historical illustrations to kind of bring this to life, which helps. But I found several illustrations of the temperance movement where it's women standing outside the saloon, demanding that their men come back home, to the family hearth where they belong, and stop spending the family money on alcohol. And the illustrations would show the women praying, and then it'd show the men in the saloon with their arms crossed, looking angry and hostile. But what was that saying? That was saying that it's up to women to moralize men, and that men are not naturally moral. That, like I said earlier, men are more naturally prone to sin and vice, especially when it comes to things like sex and alcohol. So that's what I meant by the demoralization of the masculine character. The ideal for masculinity was losing its moral character, losing the idea that no, men are called and equipped to be the moral leaders both in the home and in the broader society.
Yeah. And so we'll have to jump ahead several decades to get to today. But today, now we're dealing with these arguments over toxic masculinity and men constantly being told that they have to rid themselves of all their toxic masculinity, even in very manly products such as Gillette razors. They're talking about how their men need to do better whenever they buy their razors. What's the problem with this idea of toxic masculinity?
Well, there's several. So let me jump on one of them. One of them is it ignores the fact that men are actually doing worse today than they have in the past. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education, from kindergarten on. Even in kindergarten, girls are more verbal. They have better fine motor control, so they can manipulate the crayon or the scissors. So in kindergarten already, boys are starting to fall behind and feel like, I can't do this. This is not for me. In high school, in college. Colleges now are average 60% women, 40% men.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the average. Some have gone up to 70-30, and places like Harvard, there've been articles on this in the news. Places like Harvard are quietly starting affirmative action programs for men, to get more men, because they don't want to go beyond 60-40. That's when I started at Houston Christian, we were 70-30. 70% female, 30% men. So they started a football program to bring in more men, and an engineering program to attract more men.
Wow.
Yeah. More women than men going to graduating from graduate school. More women than men, even in the professional schools like law school, veterinary school. So education, massive amounts of money have gone into creating curriculum that will be supportive of girls, and programs that are supportive of girls, and scholarships. There's at least 4 times as many scholarships for women as for men, and that's great. We don't want to say that's bad. Women are moving ahead. They're taking advantage of these things. Remember, it was really mid-20th century when women were first accepted into a lot of universities. So they've made astonishing progress. And that's good. We need to support that. But the mentality needs to shift. We now need to help boys. And a lot of feminist groups, for example, will not pay attention to that. They say, no. As long as men are still ending up as the main... The CEOs, the presidents, the owners of companies, the tech moguls, the Hollywood producers, we don't have to help men. Well, actually, that's like, at most 10% of men end up in those higher echelons. On average, men are doing worse than in the past, and worse than women in a lot of places. Not just education, but there are more male suicides, more suicide, more crime, more victims of crime, more drug addiction, more alcohol addiction. Men are actually falling behind in the workplace. We are at, sociologists have found that we are at Depression era levels of unemployment. Nobody knows that because most of these men have stopped looking for work, and so they're not showing up in the unemployment statistics. Depression era levels of unemployment, and male life expectancy has gone down over the last 4 years or so, while women's has stayed the same. So it's not just a human thing, just male life expectancy has gone down. There was a science magazine that said, the highest, the highest predictor of early death now is being male.
Wow.
So for starters, I think we need to recognize that boys and men are in trouble now, and we need to figure out how we can encourage them. We need to start having programs to encourage men from kindergarten, all the way up. We need ways to support men. The idea that men are toxic has made many people hostile to the idea that we should support men. But wait, even if you think men are hostile, you should support programs for men, because how are we going to educate them out of hostile behavior?
Yeah.
So we need to recognize now that men are in trouble.
Yeah.
Let me give you a stat on this. This is from the book, so you might remember it, but it's 2016. 2016, 46% of men 46% of men agreed that society now seems to punish men just for being men. So whether you agree with that or not, that's a lot of men who think society now punishes them just for being men.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I personally know a lot of guys who feel that way and who think that everywhere they turn in our culture right now, they're being presented as a danger, being presented as worthless, or being presented as a bad guy. Even in movies now today, it's a popular trope to know that you can judge what's going to happen in a movie just based off the poster. If there's a woman, there's a man. Woman's going to be the hero. Man's going to be the villain. Just nearly every time, with few exceptions lately. There's been these popular little movements and speakers who have come up, who they've been both, pretty much universally condemned by the secular culture, but then even within Christian circles, they've been both somewhat praised, but also pretty heavily criticized. Be people like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Jocko Willink, and others who have been reaching young men through their work. What do you think about this movement? In the last 6 to 8 years, reaching young men, and what do you think about it? The good, the bad?
Yeah, I started my book like chapter 1. I start in chapter 1 with a survey that was done by a sociologist. You can tell I love to read the academic literature. Mm-hmm. A sociologist. Let me preface it by saying this has turned out to be the most controversial book I've written, and I was surprised by that because my last book was Love Thy Body. Thy Body, which is on things like homosexuality and transgenderism. So I really thought that would be my most controversial book. But no, in the Christian world especially, this has been more controversial. And the reason is, so I have these young Christian students. The female students almost all identify as feminists. And they would get triggered anytime I said anything good about men. Wow. I'd say, men are strong. Well, women are too. Well, yes, they are. But men are physically stronger. We need to acknowledge that. And then the men, like you just mentioned, feel like the culture has been very negative toward them. When I announced that I was I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity. One of my male students said, he shot back immediately, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay, that goes in the book as an example. And I had my students, I even had my students telling, the family members or whatever, telling their parents that we were doing, I had a class on the book. This is how I get my feedback. I run a class on it. I have reading groups on it, which is great. As they would tell their family members, and invariably the first question would be, "Whose side is she on?" Like, whoa, is she some male-bashing feminist, or is she some reactionary conservative? And I was like, I don't know if you noticed when you read the first chapter, I had to rewrite that first chapter multiple times to try to disarm both sides.
Wow. And
to say, look, as Christians, we're in the world, but not of it. And therefore, we should be able to be objective. We're not polemical on either side. We're looking for the biblical view of masculinity. And what helped me the most was this survey that I mentioned. This really helped disarm both sides. So there's a sociologist who, he's very famous, so he speaks all around the world. And so he started to do this questionnaire to young men and women, to young teenagers and young adults. And he said, he would ask them two questions. Mm-hmm. First, he says, what does it mean to be a good man? If somebody dies at the funeral, at the eulogy, they say, he was a good man. What does that mean? And men had no trouble answering that. They said, and I'll read it, honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Stand up for the little guy. Be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous, give to others. Right? I mean, everybody knows. The sociologist would say to them, well, where'd you learn that? And they say, well, it's everywhere. It's just in the air we breathe. Mm-hmm. Or if they were in the West, they would often say, it's our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would ask a follow-up question. He'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh, no, that's completely different. And I'll read their words again. That means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. In other words, a lot of the things that we associate with toxic masculinity, a lot of the traits that we don't think are so good. And so there are two competing scripts for masculinity. And so the people who would ask, which side is she on? They would say, oh, okay, fine. You don't have to attack masculinity wholesale, and you don't have to defend it wholesale. You can defend the good man, and you can show what's wrong with the secular script of the real man. Right? Mm-hmm. When he said, what does it mean to be a good man? What does it mean to be a real man? Mm-hmm. And so I kind of use that throughout the whole book, in fact. When I talk about, positive traits of masculinity, the good man, which, notice, this was global. He's been talking to men in countries from Australia to Switzerland to, Ecuador. Yeah. He finds this everywhere. So what that means is men are made in God's image, and they do know what they're called to be. In fact, here's another study. This was by an anthropologist. It was the first cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. David Gilmore. And what he found is every culture, what they expect of men boils down to what he calls the 3 Ps. Provide, protect, and procreate. That is, raise a family, be a father. He's everywhere. No matter what their concept of masculinity, if it's more rough, tough, and aggressive, or it's more, gentle, because some of the South Sea islands that he studied, the concepts of masculinity were not that different from femininity. But they all expected men to do the 3 Ps. So men are made in God's image. They do know what the good man is. They do know the 3 Ps that are expected of them. But our culture tends to press upon them a more secularized definition of manhood, which we can agree that some of those elements are more toxic or more harmful or more dangerous or whatever. So we can, as Christians, we don't have to either totally defend or totally attack. We can acknowledge that there's a secular script for masculinity that is not biblical. At the same time that we support and encourage and teach men what the biblical script is of the good man.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that whenever I consider these guys who are really popular with young men today, and all guys that I've learned a lot from and listened to a lot, I think just the number one thing that they're doing right that we could learn from is that they're just approaching guys and they're saying, hey, it's okay to be you. Right? They're saying it's okay to be a guy and to enjoy guy things. Like, it's okay. You don't feel bad about that. I think that's the number one thing that they're doing that the church could do better in. And then they push a lot of the same virtues a lot of the same virtues that you describe in the good man. The problem is that they don't have a cohesive worldview that holds it all together. That defines what each one of those qualities mean, and then gives men the duty to really live them out beyond just cultural expectations or personal pride, rather than duty received from God.
Yeah, I did have to start again. I had to put this right at the beginning of the book, that there are differences between men and women, and we need to affirm those because they're created by God. And let's start with just the biology. Biology is pretty fundamental. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast twitch muscles. I had to learn that word. Fast twitch muscles, which means they can react more quickly. And it's testosterone. I mean, God gave them that, and it makes them more aggressive and competitive. And as a church, we do need to affirm the good things of masculinity. And look, like I said, this is not cultural. This is biological. These are basics. And of course, women have more estrogen, and they have children. So in every culture, women are more likely to be the ones who have work that's close to home that can be combined with raising children. By the way, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson said something really good about women too. By the way, he said it. I've seen it a couple of times. He's tried to. Many times, people define the differences between men and women in terms of what men can do and women can't. Well, that makes women sound negative. Men are stronger, women are weaker. So he counters that with, well, women's abilities are also a strength. He said, do you know what kind of strength of character it takes to take care of an infant? That you have to be on call 24 hours a day, willing to be interrupted no matter what you're doing. You have to have incredible emotional sensitivity to discern what the infant needs, because it's nonverbal. You have to have an incredible ability, a caretaking kind of abilities. He goes on and on about these are strengths, these are not weaknesses. And so I actually borrowed some of that from him in my book and said, women have their own strengths. These are strengths, not debilitations. They're not deficits. So I think it's very important that when we talk about the differences between men and women, we don't talk about it in terms of, men are stronger and women are weaker. That's why feminists got allergic to that kind of language, is because it always sounded like women got the short end of the stick. So we have to define women's strengths as also strengths of character. But in terms of male strengths, I agree that right now, well, speaking of feminism, I mean, that's one reason that women try so hard to be as good as men, right? Is because the male strengths have often been held up as superior. As soon as you say there are differences, one is held up as superior. I mean, historically, traditionally, that's what happens. So it's very important that we hold up both sets of traits as positive. And of course, in terms of character traits, personality traits, there's bell curves, right? There's a bell curve for every personality trait. There's a bell curve, and the male and female bell curves overlap quite closely. We're actually, in terms of personality traits, we're much more similar than we are different. But insofar as men are different, we need to treat those as positive, and if we don't acknowledge them, we won't put moral boundaries on them. That's the danger. If I did read, there are some feminists who will say, I read it just the other day in an article, well, if women worked out, they would be as strong as men. No, they will never be as strong as men. I mean, men just have more upper body strength, more muscle mass. What was 75% more muscle mass, 90% greater strength. No matter how much you work out, a woman's not going to be on average, the same as a man.
Yeah.
But if we don't acknowledge that, we won't put the moral restraints on it that we need to, because if men are stronger, that means they can be more dangerous in cases of abuse or assault or whatever. So we have to make sure that we acknowledge it as good and put moral restraints on it. And not be so drawn into we're both the same, we're both, men and women are the same, they're identical. They're not identical. Yeah. Who knows that is people who work with victims of sexual assault or domestic violence. There's a book by a woman who's very liberal. It's called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. If you haven't seen it yet, you'd like it. Louise Perry. So she's well known as a leftist writer until she started working at a rape crisis center, and then she had to acknowledge. You have to acknowledge the differences between men and women, because when men are stronger, and we need to say, yes, that's stronger, so that we can channel that strength in a moral way that will benefit society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it really is tragic that, once again, the culture today only pushes women to try to take the place of or achieve male virtues. Because then it diminishes or overshadows female virtues. Once again, you go back to pop culture, you see this in movies today all the time now, where you have these women who are, taking on the role in a film that a male normally would, is that you're losing out on these uniquely strong female characters and stories of strong female characters that you could have told otherwise. I think one of the biggest examples that I can think of is if you compare the original Star Wars trilogy to the newest one made by Disney. And, all of the male protagonists were replaced with female protagonists. And Princess Leia in the original trilogy is turned into General Organa. They literally start calling her General. She's the same person, but now she's this military leader. And because, once again, she has to take a man's place. And in all three movies, I was thinking, isn't this a step down? Like, maybe I got my fantasy hierarchy wrong, but isn't a princess higher than a general? Isn't this a step down for this character? And it's tragic because it is. Everything that made her... Leia is one of the best, strongest, coolest, awesome, female characters in all of American film history. And she loses all of it in the new trilogy whenever she's General Organa. And it's really tragic. And in the third one where she dies, a character says, goodbye, princess. It was the first time in all three that she had been called princess again. And it made me tear up, because what could have been what they did to this character and what they do to the way the girls think about themselves and think that they can't be great girls unless they try to be great boys,
Yeah, it's the topic of my earlier book, Love Thy Body, but I do think it's partly what's behind the transgender movement, because transgenderism has traditionally been a male phenomenon. Back when it was called transsexualism, it was almost exclusively a male phenomenon. And now we have young teenage girls who are teenagers, adolescents who are defining themselves as boys, and what's gone wrong with our girls?
Yeah.
And it's increased dramatically. When I give my lecture on this, I show a graph. So, it's kind of flat lines, and then it goes up in a steep cliff, showing the incredibly steep rise in girls claiming a transgender identity. So it's we used to have one transgender clinic in all of America. Now we have hundreds. So it does raise the question: what is happening to our girls, and why do they think it's superior to be a boy? Why do they think? Why do they harbor such hostility to their own sex, their own bodies? And I can't help but think it's partly because the masculine virtues and masculine character traits have been held up as superior, not only by men but by women.
Yeah.
I certainly, when I was a kid, I wanted to be like my dad. It was very obvious to me who had who had clout in our family. It was my dad. So I aspired to be, to take on masculine traits because I thought they were better. Well, you might know this from reading the book, but I did go through a feminist phase for several years where I read all the feminist books because I was caught up in that as well. And the denigration of what it means to be female, it didn't change until I had a kid. My first son, that's when I started rethinking.
Wow.
I started rethinking what does it mean to have, feminine virtues? What does it mean to have a child? What does it mean to be a mother? Because I had only negative views on all of these things from reading feminist literature.
Wow.
Feminist literature treats having a child as a negative thing, it takes you away from all the other things that you could be doing. Well, yeah, but what does it give you? I mean, having kids has been the best thing of my life. Now, in hindsight, it's been the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. Yeah, I love being a mother, and we homeschooled our kids even because we liked it so much we wanted them home all the time.
Yeah,
but so I think there's a bit of a change now in some women, but I do wonder if that's part of what's behind the transgender movement, because it's partly because transsexualism used to start when you were very young. I tell the story in Love Thy Body of a young boy who, before he was even walking, people said, this kid's more like a girl than a boy. And that was the traditional transsexualism. But now it's girls who seem to be very happy being girls when they were young. And it's only when they hit adolescence and teen years that they suddenly decide they're really boys. Yeah. So that does suggest a cultural influence or a social contagion that's happening. And that something is hitting them that they decide they don't want to be a girl after all. So I think your point is well taken. We need to make sure we understand what's good about masculinity, and today we also really need to focus also what's good about femininity.
Yeah. Appreciate each male and female being made in the image of God, and celebrating each of them as they are. We need to wrap up. We are getting close to the end of our time, and so before we go, just what would be your answer to how can the church and how can Christians start serving men better in the future?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, for one thing, one of the side effects of a more the secular script for masculinity, the one that I read, the real man, as opposed to the good man, is that a lot of men don't have male friendships. And so one of the most important things the church could do is to have men's groups, and men's groups that go beyond just, having a barbecue, but, in-depth, real friendships, loneliness. There have been studies of loneliness. There's a whole book giving a study of loneliness and how it contributes to early death. The emotional impact of loneliness it contributes to a whole host of diseases. But men have not been encouraged to have intensely close friendships, just friendships with men. I think what you were saying earlier about it's okay to be a guy, it's okay to be yourself. I would like to see a lot more ministry to men that was, that focuses on the whole man too, because I have had a lot of students say, oh yeah, there's some men's groups at my church, but they focus on hunting and fishing, and they kind of overemphasize the masculine aspects. And one of my students, an IT person, he said, I don't connect with that. I'm an IT person. Or another person who's a writer, or a psychologist. I'm a psychologist. I care about the inner life. I'm not into the sort of rough, tough external masculinity. So I think even our men's groups, when we do start them, we kind of overemphasize, from what I'm hearing at least, because I'm not a man, so I haven't been in these groups, but what I'm hearing from a lot of my students is that they don't like these men's groups when they almost go the other extreme, when they almost go to the extreme of emphasizing masculinity. Even at the high school level, one of my students told me about a Christian high school where they started a men's group, Christian manhood. That's what they call it, Christian manhood group. Mm-hmm. But the student who was spearheading it was from a military family, and he was focusing only on sort of military type virtues, of toughness and courage and strength. And the student wanted to be. He was studying psychology, and he said, "No, I don't fit in that group." So I've heard from a lot of my students that they don't fit into their church's men's groups. So I think we need to sort of rethink the men's groups we do have. Are we ministering to the whole person? Don't just react against the culture and sort of overemphasize one aspect of masculinity, because you lose a lot of them. You lose a lot of men who don't fit the John Wayne masculinity stereotype. So, but I think the church, the most important thing the church can do, besides preaching on manhood from the pulpit, of course, is having men's groups where, peers. All the psychological data shows that we benefit more from being in a peer group. The AA model, this Alcoholics Anonymous model, the Celebrate Recovery model. The idea that sitting around with your peers and discussing things is the best way forward. And there's in my book, you haven't gotten to that part yet, but when I get into the section on domestic violence, there have been some pioneering organizations that have found that even there, the AA model works best. Get abusive men together and talk to each other. Most of these men are in counseling. It's court-ordered counseling, right? If you are actually abusive, you're usually not seeking out counseling unless the court orders you. But there's been a couple of pioneering groups now that have found they get much better results from having a peer group with other men. These other men can see through you when you. It's like AA; they can see through you when you're not being honest. Yeah. So I think that's one of the most important things that men can do. And secondly, the church needs to stress fatherhood. Toxic masculinity, the toxic traits that the culture doesn't like, are certainly largely a product of boys growing up without fathers. Like crime being the primary example. I used to work for Prison Fellowship, which is an international Christian ministry. And we knew from the stats that the majority of the men sitting in prison come from fatherless homes, especially violent crime. They're coming from fatherless homes. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but violent prisoners, 70 to 80% of violent prisoners are from fatherless homes. Most of the kids who are having trouble in school, dropping out of school, are from fatherless homes. So we know there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is not a left-right issue anymore. It used to be. But a couple decades ago, I still remember when the left finally started acknowledging that, growing up with two parents does have a better outcome. Okay. So the second thing is, so get men together. The second thing is really focus on training fathers to be better fathers and reaching out to fatherless kids. I think that should be a primary mission goal of every church, is to reach out to fatherless kids. And, provide substitute fathers. There have been some examples. I gave some examples in the book. There was a really fun one. There'd been a shooting at a school, and a bunch of fathers came in and just started walking down the halls and being a presence. Just bring a presence. He said, we've had too much violence in our schools.
Yeah. And I think I heard that story. Yeah.
So that was a cool story. I think this church needs to start thinking more intentionally about how it ministers to men, and particularly how it trains fathers and how it reaches out to fatherless kids. Yeah,
that's excellent. I agree with all those. We just started a new men's and women's ministry at our church, where I'm a pastor, and in designing them. Particularly on the men's side. On the women's side, I'm letting them, take it and run with it and so on. But on the men's side, where I'm a little bit more hands-on, we're making all of our meetings together something that's very much activity-based. So it's not just sitting in a circle talking about our feelings, because everybody knows guys aren't really into that, but we don't mind opening up whenever it's doing something together. I think that's the key that just most people don't understand about guys, is that guys can open up and be vulnerable, but it's just not in that it has to be with another medium, right? They got to be doing an activity together, doing something together, and then that leads to building those relationships where they open up. So anyway, so it's very activity based, but then we're also ensuring that it reaches the guys who like the hunting and fishing and the guys who aren't into that. And so we're trying to be really creative and outside the box by constantly changing what we do for activity. So, so we have plans we're going to go hiking. We have plans to do, different types of things, but then also like going to, we have this event downtown once a month called Art Walk, where all the galleries are open for free and you can go walk around and enjoy the art. So we plan on doing that as well, because our goal is to explore what it means for a man to be filled with the Holy Spirit in all expressions of that masculinity, and not just, one narrowly heavily cultured way of viewing it. So
that's pretty cool, because one of my graduate students, who is a male, and we were talking about this, he said, well, he said, I'd like to go to an art museum. He said that. So that's cool that you've got that on your list.
Yeah. My goal is to do something that gets at least I want to make sure that all the guys feel a little bit uncomfortable at least one of the meetings. So if it's the artsy guys, I'm going to feel a little uncomfortable throwing a football. If it's the football guys, I'm going to feel a little uncomfortable walking around an art museum. Because I think that whenever we step into those things, along with God, that He grows us and He shows us more about what it means to be a man than we knew before.
What you should do, this is my suggestion. So what you should do is, before you go to the art museum, read Saving Leonardo, because it's about how worldviews shape the arts, how philosophies shape the arts. And what I found with my students is I've had a lot of students who didn't necessarily think they liked the arts. When I was teaching homeschool high schoolers, one of the students kind of strode in, sort of swaggered in and said, he didn't want to be there. His mother was making him sign up, right? And he said, are you going to tell us why a pile of bricks can be called art? And I said, yes, I am. And I do. I made a point of putting the pile of bricks in here. It was at the Tate in London. And explaining the worldview behind it, though. And I found that a lot of my students are much more interested in the arts if they see, oh, okay, so there's some ideas here. They're not just playing with colors, They're not just painting pretty pictures. They actually are influenced by a philosophy, by a worldview. And if you can detect the philosophy through the art, then it becomes much more intellectually interesting. So I do get art students who find out, oh, wow, art's about a lot more. But I get far more students who are not artists, because, there are far fewer people who do like the arts. Yeah. But they learn to like the arts when they see, the artists actually engaged with the ideas of their day. And so there's an intellectual component that will, I would say especially men, might be more attracted to that.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely, and you're correct that I've always had a fellow drawn to the arts. Even though people usually look at me and just think of me as a meathead, I'm actually very into music, art, film, and so on. But one of the things that really just drew that out of me was reading books like Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live? And talking about the worldviews behind art and so on. And so that's a great idea. And I have Saving Leonardo. It's one of the ones that I have, but I haven't read yet. So perfect reason to read it and then share with the guys. But we have gone well over our time. So I just want to thank you for spending the time to be with us here on Filter today. Once again, the book that we talked about, along with a lot of other things, but the book we talked about is The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. I'll have it linked in the show notes so that you guys can go and pre-order it and get your copy. I highly, highly recommend it. And so once again, Nancy, just want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the